Jimmy Hoffa was one of the most powerful men in America. He controlled the largest union in the country. He had the personal phone numbers of presidents, senators, and mafia bosses. He had survived federal prosecutors, assassination attempts, and 13 years of legal battles. He was not the kind of man who just disappeared. And yet, on the afternoon of July the 30th, 1975, he drove to a restaurant parking lot in Michigan, got into a car, and was never seen again. No body, no arrest, no conviction, just a parking lot, a car pulling away, and 50 years of silence. The FBI knows who did it. The suspects have been identified, investigated, and interviewed. Every one of them died without being charged. And somewhere in the ground of the American Midwest, the most famous missing person in history is still waiting to be found. On the afternoon of July 30th, 1975, Hoffa drove to a restaurant called the Mattress Red Fox in Bloomfield Township, Michigan. He was meeting two men: Anthony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters, official with documented connections to the Genovese crime family, and Anthony Giacalone, a Detroit mafia figure known as Tony Jack. Hoffa arrived at 2 p.m. Neither man showed up. He made several phone calls from the parking lot, expressing frustration that he was being kept waiting. A witness saw him getting into a car around 2:45 p.m. That was the last confirmed sighting of James Riddle Hoffa. He was 62 years old. Jimmy Hoffa had built the International Brotherhood of Teamsters into the largest and most powerful union in America. At its peak, the Teamsters represented over 2 million workers, with truck drivers, warehouse workers, and laborers whose collective muscle could bring the American economy to its knees. Hoffa understood that power, and he used it with extraordinary effectiveness. He secured better wages, better conditions, and better benefits for working-class Americans who had previously had almost no leverage against their employers. He was genuinely beloved by the workers he represented. He was also deeply corrupt. The Teamsters Pension Fund, under Hoffa's control, became a source of loans to organized crime figures across America. Mob bosses in Chicago, Las Vegas, New York, and Detroit borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars from the fund to build casinos, businesses, and criminal enterprises. Hoffa knew exactly who he was lending to and why. Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, made destroying Hoffa one of the central missions of his career. The two men despised each other with an intensity that was personal as much as professional. In 1964, Kennedy's relentless pursuit succeeded. Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering and later of fraud related to the Teamsters Pension Fund. He was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. He began serving his sentence in 1967. In December 1971, President Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence with a condition Hoffa had not sought and did not want. The commutation included a restriction prohibiting Hoffa from engaging in union activities until 1980. The restriction was inserted at the request of Frank Fitzsimmons, the Teamsters president who had taken over from Hoffa and who had no interest in Hoffa returning to reclaim his union. Fitzsimmons had the support of organized crime figures who found him more pliable than Hoffa. The specific circumstances of why Nixon inserted that restriction and what, if anything, was exchanged for it have never been fully established. What is documented is that the restriction kept Hoffa out of the Teamsters and that the people who benefited most were the organized crime figures who had invested in Fitzsimmons' continued control. Hoffa spent the years after his release fighting the restriction in court and making clear his intention to return to union leadership. He was a direct threat to the arrangements that had developed during his absence. On July 30th, 1975, he drove to meet the two men who represented exactly those arrangements. Provenzano and Giacalone both provided alibis for that afternoon. Both alibis were considered by investigators to be implausible. Neither man was ever charged. The FBI investigated for years. Their investigation identified several suspects connected to organized crime. The leading theory, accepted by most investigators, was that Hoffa had been killed by the mafia to prevent his return to union leadership, and that his body had been disposed of in a way that would never be found. Multiple informants over the years provided accounts of what had happened. Several sites have been searched. A horse farm in New Jersey was searched in 2006. Nothing was found. A driveway in Michigan was dug up in 2012. Nothing was found. A field in New Jersey was searched in 2013. Nothing was found. In 2021, a former Detroit mob associate claimed before his death that he knew where Hoffa was buried in a field in Oakland Township, Michigan. The field was searched. Nothing was found. The FBI has never officially closed the Hoffa investigation. It remains technically open as an active missing persons and suspected homicide case. Jimmy Hoffa was one of the most powerful men in America. He had connections that reached from the White House to the mafia. He drove to a parking lot in Michigan one afternoon to meet two men, and then he was gone. The body is somewhere. 50 years of searching have not found it. The people who know where it is have chosen silence over truth. And they have calculated correctly that silence is the safest choice they will ever make.